The fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the log walls of the Hartwell ranch house. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, just as it had 34 winters before. Samuel Hartwell sat in his leather chair, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. At 68, his hair had turned the color of January clouds, but his eyes still held that sharp clarity that came from a lifetime of hard choices. Across from him, his grandson Daniel perched on the edge of the sofa, 16 years old and hungry for stories the way only the young can be. The boy had been asking questions all evening, circling around the subject like a wolf around a campfire until finally he had worked up the courage to ask the one thing he'd always wondered. "Grandpa, how did you and Grandma Kate really meet?" Samuel looked past the boy, through the window where snow accumulated on the sill. His mind drifted back across decades, across winters, to a night when the world had been smaller and colder and infinitely more desperate. "Same kind of night as this," he said quietly. 34 winters ago. I was a different man then." "Different how?" Samuel set down his cup and reached for the leather-bound journal on the side table. The binding was cracked with age, the pages yellowed in bristle. Inside were maps, letters, certificates of birth and death, and one envelope that had changed everything. "I had money but no soul," Samuel said, opening the book carefully, "until I met 6 people who changed everything." He pulled out a brittle piece of paper, a letter written in faded ink. At the bottom, in handwriting that trembled with age or fear or both, were the words, "If you find this, you'll know what matters." "This," Samuel said, holding up the letter, "is where it began. December 18th, 1886, the coldest night I ever lived through." The boy leaned forward and Samuel began. "The wind that night didn't just blow, it hunted. It came down from the Bitterroot Mountains with the patience of a predator, searching for exposed skin, for gaps in walls, for anything warm and alive that it could drain of heat." Samuel Hartwell stood at the edge of his property, checking the eastern fence line where wolves had been testing his defenses for weeks. 8 goats represented most of his livestock, and he couldn't afford to lose even one. At 34, Samuel looked older than his years. Work had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. His hands were calloused from splitting wood and digging post holes, though the calluses were still relatively new. 2 years earlier, those same hands had signed documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without a second thought. Now they bled when he worked too long without gloves. He wore a buffalo hide coat that had cost him $15, more than most ranchers in Montana Territory could spare for winter wear. His boots were genuine leather, not the cheap canvas and rubber most settlers made do with. And in his cabin, buried under the floorboards in a Diebold safe, sat $64,000 in cash in bearer bonds. A fortune by any measure. Blood money by his own reckoning. The fence was solid. He'd rebuilt it himself that fall, learning through trial and error how to sink posts deep enough to withstand the freeze and thaw cycles. The barbed wire was tight, purchased new from the mercantile in Coldwater for 40 cents per 100 feet. Everything he owned now, he'd bought with money he wished he'd never earned. He was turning back toward the cabin, already thinking about the fire he'd left banked and the coffee that would be lukewarm by now, when he saw them. 7 shapes moving through the snow about 200 yards east, struggling along what used to be the old Bozeman Trail before winter had buried it under 3 feet of white. Samuel stopped. His breath formed clouds in front of his face as he watched the figures stumble through drifts that came up to their knees. They were moving east, away from Coldwater, away from any settlement he knew of. East meant the cliff face where Prospect Creek had carved a gorge through granite. East meant dead ends and false trails and 100 ways to die in the dark. He kicked his horse into motion, cutting across his land at an angle that would intercept them. As he drew closer, details emerged from the white chaos. A woman in front, moving with the mechanical determination of someone past exhaustion. 5 children behind her, the oldest a boy of maybe 13, carrying 2 sacks that looked far too heavy for his frame. And in the woman's arms, wrapped in what appeared to be the last clean quilt she owned, a baby. The woman was tall, maybe 5'6", but so thin that her coat seemed to hang on her frame like laundry on a line. Ice had formed at the hem of her skirt, creating a stiff fringe that crackled with each step. Her face, what he could see of it beneath a wool shawl, was gaunt and gray. But her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were still fighting. Samuel stopped his horse 20 feet away, not wanting to spook them. He'd learned that desperate people could be as dangerous as cornered animals. "You're headed the wrong way," he said, keeping his voice level. "Cliffside's 300 yards east." The woman stopped. Behind her, the children stopped too, huddling together like sheep. The baby in her arms wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. That was a bad sign. "We're not lost," the woman said. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "We're walking." "To where?" "East. Billings, somewhere with a church." Samuel looked at the baby again. In the dim light from the cloud-covered moon, he could see the child's face. Blue-tinged lips, skin the color of old snow. The baby's chest rose and fell, but slowly, too slowly. "Boy's hypothermic," Samuel said. "You got maybe an hour." The woman's face didn't change. "I know." For a moment, they stood there in the screaming wind, two strangers measuring each other. Samuel saw in her face a kind of exhausted defiance, the look of someone who'd stopped asking for help because help never came. He saw her children shivering behind her, saw the oldest boy trying not to show how much those sacks weighed, saw a little girl of maybe 5 who stopped crying because she no longer had the energy, and he saw Emma. Not really, he knew that. But in the dim light with snow whipping between them, the baby's pale hair looked just like his niece's had looked. The same fine blonde wisps, the same small, perfect face, the same stillness that came just before the end. The memory hit him like a fist. Emma running toward him at the Chicago station, arms outstretched, laughing. Emma, 2 hours later, pulled from the wreckage of Train 47, her skull crushed by falling timber, her small body broken beyond any hope of repair. Emma buried next to her father, his brother David, in a cemetery where Samuel paid for perpetual care but never visited because he couldn't bear to see the headstones that read their names in his guilt. "Follow me," Samuel heard himself say. The woman's eyes narrowed. "We can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." She studied him for another long moment, and Samuel knew what she was seeing. A stranger on a horse, offering help that probably came with conditions. In her position, he'd be suspicious too. But she was also a mother standing in a blizzard with 6 children and nowhere to go. And mothers in that situation had to take risks that no one should have to take. "All right," she said finally. Samuel dismounted and walked to her. Up close, she looked even worse. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her hands clutching the baby were red and swollen with chilblains. When he reached for the child, she hesitated, her arms tightening protectively. "I'm just going to put him on the saddle," Samuel said quietly. "Keep him out of the wind." After a heartbeat, she released her grip. The baby barely reacted when Samuel lifted him, which confirmed what he'd feared. He unwrapped his own buffalo coat and swaddled the child in it, then placed him carefully on the horse's saddle, using the leather to create a windbreak. The baby's core temperature was probably somewhere between 82 and 86 degrees. Any lower, and he wouldn't make it. "How far?" the woman asked. "Quarter-mile. Can you walk it?" "I've walked 16 miles today. I can walk another quarter." Samuel led them south and west, back toward his cabin. The wind fought them every step, but now they had direction. Now they had hope. He watched the woman from the corner of his eye, saw her counting her children every 30 seconds, lips moving silently. He counted too. 6 of them, ranging from the teenage boy down to the baby. All of them too thin, too quiet, too used to hardship. They'd been walking for about 10 minutes when the oldest boy stumbled and nearly fell. Samuel caught him by the arm, felt how light he was, how unsteady. The sacks he carried weighed maybe 30 pounds combined, but on a starving frame, that was more than enough. "I got it," the boy said, trying to pull away. "I know you do," Samuel said, "but let me take one anyway." The boy looked to his mother, who nodded. Samuel slung one sack over his shoulder. Inside he felt clothes, hard bread, a tin cup, everything they owned, probably. Everything they'd managed to carry when someone had put them out. 15 minutes later, the cabin emerged from the snow. It wasn't much. 20 feet by 24, built from lodgepole pine with a tin roof that drummed when it rained. But smoke rose from the chimney, and light glowed warm behind oilcloth windows. And after 16 miles in a blizzard, it must have looked like paradise. Samuel opened the door, and heat rushed out to meet them. The woman made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and then her knees buckled. The teenage boy caught her, stronger than he looked, and helped her inside. The other children followed, moving like sleepwalkers, and Samuel came last, carrying the baby. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface radiating blessed warmth. A rough-hewn table and 4 chairs occupied the center of the room. A bed stood against the far wall, covered in wool blankets. Shelves held canned goods, flour sacks, coffee tins. A Winchester rifle hung above the door, and below it, a Colt Peacemaker in its holster. Samuel went straight to the stove and began stoking the fire, adding oak logs from the wood box. The temperature in the room was maybe 45 degrees. He needed it up to 68, minimum. While the fire built, he filled a kettle with water from the barrel by the door and set it to heat. Not boiling, just warm. About 100 degrees. Too hot, and the shock could kill the baby. Too cold, and it wouldn't help. The woman had collapsed into one of the chairs, still holding herself upright through sheer will. The children clustered around her, nobody speaking, all of them watching Samuel with wary eyes. He ignored them for now, focusing on the baby. He unwrapped the buffalo coat and examined the child. A boy, maybe 18 months old, skin gray and waxy, pulse weak but present, maybe 40 beats per minute when it should be 120 or 130. Pupils responsive but sluggish, moderate hypothermia. Survivable if he worked fast. Samuel soaked a clean cloth in the warm water and began wiping the baby's face and hands, bringing circulation back to the extremities. Then he wrapped hot water bottles in towels and placed them at the baby's armpits and groin, where the major arteries ran close to the surface. After 20 minutes, the baby's color improved slightly. After 30, the child whimpered. After 40, he cried. The woman broke then, her face crumpling as she heard her son's voice. She covered her mouth with both hands and wept silently, her whole body shaking. The teenage boy put his arm around her shoulders, and the other children pressed close, and Samuel turned away to give them what privacy he could. He found bread in the pantry, hard rye loaves he'd baked 3 days ago. He sliced them thick and spread them with salt pork fat, then set them on the table along with a jar of well water. The children stared at the food but didn't move until the woman nodded permission. Then they ate like wolves, barely chewing, cramming bread into their mouths with both hands. One of the girls, maybe 9 years old, started crying as she ate, tears running down her face, and she didn't seem to notice or care. Samuel stood by the stove, holding the baby, who had finally stopped crying and was now making small, sleepy sounds. The woman watched him, her eyes red but clear. "Thank you," she said. Samuel shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. Get warm first. Get fed. Then we'll talk." But she kept watching him, and he saw the question forming in her eyes. The one everyone asked eventually, the one he dreaded most. Why? Why would a stranger riding alone in a blizzard stop to help? Why would he bring them to his home, feed them, warm them, ask nothing in return? People didn't do that, not without reason, not without expectation. The world had taught her that lesson, probably more than once. Samuel looked down at the baby in his arms, at the fine blonde hair and the small, perfect face. And for a moment he was back in Illinois, standing beside 2 coffins, watching them lower his brother and his niece into frozen ground. "You can stay tonight," he said quietly. "Maybe longer if you need. We'll figure it out tomorrow." The woman opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Why are you helping us?" "Because somebody should have helped sooner." It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even half the truth. But it was all he could give her right now, standing in a cabin that still felt empty even with 7 people in it, holding a child who reminded him of all the ways he'd failed. The woman seemed to accept that, or at least to stop questioning. She took the baby from him and carried him to the bed, laying him down gently on the blankets. The other children followed, gravitating toward the warmth and softness like moths to flame. Within minutes they were asleep, tangled together in a heap of limbs and borrowed quilts. Samuel stepped outside into the screaming wind. The cold hit him like a wall, but he welcomed it. It helped him think. It helped him remember why he'd come to this God-forsaken territory in the first place. He'd come to Montana to disappear, to live small and die alone, and hopefully, eventually, stop seeing Emma's face every time he closed his eyes. He'd bought this land cheap, built this cabin with his own hands, learned to survive on almost nothing. For 2 years, he'd spoken to maybe a dozen people. He'd gone into cold water once a month for supplies and spoken only enough words to complete his purchases. He'd kept his head down and his past buried and convinced himself that isolation was the same thing as penance. But tonight he'd broken his own rules. He'd seen people in need and he'd helped them, not because it would absolve him of anything, not because it would bring David and Emma back, but because standing there in the snow, watching a woman carry her dying child toward a cliff face in the dark, he'd realized that he had a choice. He could let them go. He could ride back to his cabin in his solitude and his comfortable misery. He could tell himself that it wasn't his problem, that he'd done his penance already, that he deserved peace, or he could do what he should have done 2 years ago, 4 years ago, every day of his life since March 15th, 1885. He could help. He could act. He could be the person he'd failed to be when it mattered most. The door opened behind him and the woman stepped out, wrapped in one of his blankets. She moved carefully, as if testing whether her legs would support her weight. When she reached his side, she stood in silence for a long moment, both of them watching snow fall in the darkness. "I'm Catherine Brennan," she said finally. "Those are my children, Caleb, Ruth, Henry, Josephine, Louisa, and Thomas. The baby. Samuel Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, I need you to understand something. I have nothing to offer you. No money, no labor worth paying for, no skills that matter out here. I can't even promise I'll be gone soon because I have nowhere to go." Samuel nodded slowly. "All right. So why?" He was quiet for a long time, watching his breath form clouds. Finally he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "Had a brother once, and a niece. She was 4 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, smiled at everything." He paused, his throat working. "There was an accident, train derailment, March of '85. I was supposed to meet them at the station, but I was late. By the time I got there, the rescue crews were already pulling bodies from the wreckage." Catherine didn't speak, didn't move. "Found David first, my brother. He was already gone. Then I found Emma. She was still breathing, but barely. Held her for maybe 20 minutes before she slipped away. Last thing she did was open her eyes and look at me, and I swear to God, Mrs. Brennan, she knew. She knew I'd failed her. Mr. Hartwell, I sold everything after that. My business, my house, everything I owned. Paid compensation to every family who lost someone in that wreck. Then I came here to this God-forsaken territory and built this cabin and told myself I'd spend the rest of my life alone because that's what I deserved." He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "But tonight, when I saw you carrying that baby, I saw Emma, and I realized something. I can't save her. I can't save David, but I can save you. And that might not be redemption, and it might not be forgiveness, but it's something. It's a choice to be better than I was." Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't your fault, the accident." "Yes, it was," Samuel said simply. "I owned the company. I cut costs on maintenance to increase profit margins. The brakes failed because I didn't want to spend money replacing them. 29 people died because I wanted to save $300. The wind howled between them, carrying snow that stung like needles. I killed them, Mrs. Brennan. All of them, including my own family. And I've been trying to die ever since, but apparently wish or fate or whatever you want to call it has other plans. So I'm still here, and you're here, and those children are here, and maybe that means something." Catherine reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold and rough and trembling, but her grip was firm. "My husband died in May," she said. "Pneumonia and typhoid. We couldn't afford a doctor. By the time the fever broke, he was already gone. Took me 3 days to dig his grave because the ground was still half frozen. The children helped, even Thomas, who was barely walking. She paused, gathering strength. We held on through summer. Barely. Had a drought in July. Grasshoppers in August. Lost most of the crop. Banks sent letters. I couldn't read them at first because I couldn't see through the tears, but eventually I figured out what they said. Foreclosure, debt, eviction. Legal words for being thrown out of your home with nothing but what you can carry. When? This morning. Man named Martin Cleary came with the sheriff. Said I had until sundown. I packed what I could, started walking at 4 in the afternoon. Figured we'd reach Billings in maybe 4 days if we walked 12 hours a day. Find a church, find charity, find something. Samuel felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. They put you out in winter? With 6 children? Law's the law, Mr. Hartwell. Woman can't hold a deed without a man. Soon as James died, the land reverted to the bank. Or that's what Cleary said anyway. That's not how it works, not in Montana territory. You should have inherited. Should have, but didn't. And I didn't have money for a lawyer, so I took what they let me take, and I walked. They stood together in the cold, 2 people carrying more weight than any human should have to bear, finding a strange comfort in shared pain. You can stay, Samuel said, as long as you need. People will talk. Let them. The church will object, a widow living with an unmarried man. Then the church can freeze in a blizzard and see how much they care about propriety. Catherine laughed, a short, bitter sound. You're different from most men I've known, Mr. Hartwell. Is that good or bad? I don't know yet. Ask me in a week. They went back inside where it was warm. The children were still asleep, a tangle of limbs and borrowed blankets that looked like safety and innocence, and everything Samuel had lost. Catherine settled into a chair by the fire, and Samuel took up position by the window, watching the snow fall and the darkness deepen. Around midnight, the baby woke crying. Catherine fed him from her breast, though Samuel could tell from her wince that her milk was thin and sparse. The boy drank anyway, desperate for anything, and eventually drifted back to sleep. Catherine held him long after that, rocking slightly, her eyes distant. What happens tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow you rest, eat, get your strength back. And after that, we'll figure it out. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was honest. Samuel had no plan, no scheme, no grand solution to the problem of 7 people with nowhere to go and a widow with no legal standing. All he had was this cabin, this land, and $64,000 that he'd sworn never to touch again. But as he sat there watching Catherine hold her son, watching the other children sleep in peace for what was probably the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but possibility. The chance that maybe, just maybe, he could be something other than the man who'd killed 29 people through negligence and greed. The chance to be the man who'd offered shelter to strangers in their darkest hour and kept his word. Outside, the wind continued to hunt. The snow continued to fall. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero, cold enough to kill anyone caught outside without shelter. But inside the cabin, 7 people slept warm and safe, and 1 man stood watch. And for the first time in 2 years, Samuel Hartwell felt something very close to purpose. He didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire burning, kept watch at the window, kept his rifle close, in case wolves or worse came calling. And when dawn finally broke gray and cold over the Montana territory, he stepped outside to check his land and found the world transformed. Snow had buried everything under 3 feet of white. The fence line was invisible. The trail back to Coldwater was gone. They were cut off, at least for a few days, maybe a week. Good, Samuel thought. It would give them time. Time to recover. Time to plan. Time to figure out how to keep a promise he'd made without thinking, to people he barely knew, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He was splitting wood for the stove when Caleb emerged from the cabin. The boy looked better after a night's sleep, less gaunt, more alert. He watched Samuel work for a moment, then picked up the second axe without being asked. Show me, Caleb said. So Samuel showed him how to grip the handle, how to swing from the shoulder, not the wrist, how to let the weight of the axe do most of the work. The boy learned fast, his movements becoming more efficient with each swing. By the time they'd cut enough wood for 3 days, Caleb was smiling slightly, pleased with himself. "You're a good teacher," the boy said. "You're a good student." They carried the wood inside together. Catherine was awake, nursing Thomas again. The other children were stirring, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Samuel put coffee on to boil and sliced more bread. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but it was something. It was enough. After they'd eaten, Catherine helped clean up while the children explored the cabin with the cautious curiosity of animals in new territory. Ruth, the 11-year-old girl, found Samuel's harmonica on a shelf and held it up questioningly. "Go ahead," Samuel said. She tried a few notes, tentative and off-key, then set it down carefully. Josephine, the 7-year-old, discovered his collection of books, mostly technical manuals about engineering and construction, but also a few novels he'd brought from Chicago and never finished. Henry, the 9-year-old boy, went straight to the Winchester above the door, staring at it with the focused intensity of a child who understood that survival sometimes required violence. And Louisa, the 5-year-old, the one who'd been too cold to cry yesterday, now ran from window to window, pressing her face against the oilcloth to watch snowfall in daylight. She laughed, a high, clear sound that filled the cabin like music. Samuel found himself smiling. Actually smiling. When was the last time he'd done that? When was the last time this cabin had held laughter? That afternoon, while the children played quiet games by the fire, Samuel sat with Catherine at the table. He pulled out paper and pencil and began asking questions. Where had she lived? How much land? What were the circumstances of the foreclosure? Did she have the original deed? Did James have family who might contest the eviction? Catherine answered as best she could, though some details were hazy. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't thought much about legality. But one thing became clear quickly. Martin Cleary, the man who'd evicted her, was the same Martin Cleary who held the mortgage. And his son, Edward Cleary, was a lawyer in St. Louis with a reputation for aggressive debt collection. "They're going to come after you," Samuel said quietly. "For what? I have nothing." "For the children. If they can prove you're unfit, they can have the state take custody, place the kids with families who will use them for labor." Catherine's face went pale. "They wouldn't. They would. I've seen it happen. Orphan trains, indenture contracts. It's legal and it's profitable and they won't hesitate." "Then what do I do?" Samuel leaned back thinking. The obvious answer was marriage. A widow with a husband had legal standing. She could contest the foreclosure, fight for her land, protect her children. But that would require finding someone willing to marry a woman with 6 children and no assets. That would require trust and time and paperwork. And they had none of those things. Unless. The thought came to him suddenly, fully formed, dangerous, complicated, but possible. "I need to think," Samuel said. "Give me a day." Catherine studied his face. "You're planning something." "Maybe. Something risky. Definitely." "Will it work?" "I don't know, but it might be your only chance." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll trust you, Mr. Hartwell." God help us both. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Samuel took out the leather journal from the safe under the floorboards. He opened it to a blank page and began writing. Not a letter exactly, more like a contract. An agreement between two people who barely knew each other, outlining terms and conditions and consequences. When he finished, he read it over 3 times, looking for flaws, finding dozens, but none that mattered. Then he closed the journal and put it away and sat in the darkness, listening to 7 people breathe in sleep. Tomorrow he would make his proposal. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would take the first real step toward becoming someone other than the man who'd killed his own family through negligence and greed. But tonight, he was just Samuel Hartwell, a man alone in a cabin in Montana Territory, watching over people who trusted him for no good reason, trying to figure out how to keep a promise that might be impossible to keep. The wind outside had died down. The snow had stopped falling. In the sudden silence, Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He was still alive, still here, still capable of choosing who he wanted to be. That would have to be enough. Samuel paused, setting his coffee cup on the side table with a soft clink. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the room. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, completely absorbed. "So you had the money all along?" the boy asked. "Why didn't you just pay off whatever debt they claimed?" Samuel smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because it wasn't about money, boy. It was about who had the right to claim what. And I'd be damned if I let those vultures take her family." "But how did you fight them? $3,500 in 1887, that's about 110,000 today. And yes, I had it, but the law didn't care about money. It cared about blood and marriage." Daniel's eyes widened. "So you—" "I asked her, not because I had to, because I wanted to, but first we had to prove the debt was a lie." Samuel reached for another log, placed it carefully on the coals, and watched sparks spiral up the chimney. Then he continued. The letter arrived on January 1st, 1887, New Year's Day. Catherine had joked that morning about fresh starts and new beginnings, and then a boy on a mule had ridden up through snow that was still knee-deep in places, carrying a leather pouch of mail from Coldwater. Only one letter was addressed to Catherine Brennan. The envelope was thick, official, sealed with red wax bearing the imprint of Cleary and Associates, Legal Counsel, St. Louis, Missouri. Samuel watched her face as she read it, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands begin to tremble. When she finished, she set the letter down very carefully, as if it might explode, and looked at him with eyes that had gone hollow. "They want everything," she whispered. Samuel picked up the letter and read. The language was dense, full of legal terminology that was designed to confuse and intimidate, but the message was clear. James Brennan's cousins, Tobias and Lucas Brennan of St. Louis, were claiming the Dry Fork property based on territorial inheritance law. Furthermore, they were claiming an outstanding debt of $3,500, allegedly owed by James's father Elijah to the Brennan family estate, dated 1872 and never repaid. The letter gave Catherine 30 days to settle the debt or vacate any claim to the property. Failure to comply would result in foreclosure and potential criminal charges of fraud. And there was one more paragraph, buried near the end, that made Samuel's blood run cold. "It has come to our attention that you are currently residing with an unrelated male, Mr. Samuel Hartwell, without benefit of matrimony. We advise you that such arrangements may jeopardize your custody of 6 minor children. The Montana Orphans Court may intervene if deemed necessary for the children's welfare." Samuel read that paragraph twice, feeling rage build hot and steady in his chest. They were threatening to take her children. Not because Catherine was unfit, not because the children were in danger, but because she'd accepted help from a stranger. And that help could be twisted into something improper, something scandalous, something that gave the courts an excuse to separate a mother from her children and place those children with families who would work them like animals. Caleb stood in the doorway, having heard his mother's distress. "Ma, what is it?" Catherine couldn't speak. Samuel folded the letter and handed it to the boy. Caleb read quickly, his young face hardening with each line. When he finished, he looked at Samuel with eyes that were suddenly much older than 13. "What do we do?" "We fight," Samuel said. That evening, after the younger children were asleep, Samuel, Catherine, and Caleb sat around the table. Samuel had pulled out his own papers, maps of the territory, copies of homestead laws, notes he'd made over the past 2 years about local regulations and legal precedents. He'd learned to be thorough. In his old life, lack of attention to detail had cost 29 people their lives. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Montana territorial law," Samuel said, spreading out a document. "When a man dies without a will, his property goes to his blood relatives. Wife has no automatic claim unless specifically named in a legal document." "James didn't have a will," Catherine said quietly. "We couldn't afford a lawyer." "Right. So technically the Brennan cousins have standing to claim the land, unless we can prove the inheritance was already settled or that you have legal protection through another means." "What other means?" Samuel looked at her steadily. "Marriage. If you remarry, your new husband can claim spousal property rights. The cousins would lose their standing." Catherine stared at him. "Are you suggesting—" "Not yet. First, we need to deal with the debt. $3,500 from 1872. That's 15 years ago. If it's real, with interest compounded at 12% annually, they should be claiming $17,000, not $3,500. The fact that they're only claiming the original amount means one of two things. Either they're being generous, which I doubt, or the debt was already paid and they're lying about it. Caleb leaned forward. Pa used to keep a ledger. He wrote everything down, every penny spent, every debt owed. If Grandpa Elijah paid that debt, Pa would have known about it. Where's the ledger now? Martin Cleary took all the papers when he foreclosed, said they were part of the estate. Samuel nodded slowly. That fit. Take the evidence, control the narrative. Classic intimidation tactic. But there was usually a copy somewhere. People who kept ledgers tended to be meticulous. They didn't trust single records. Did your grandfather keep records before he died? Catherine thought for a moment. He died in 81, 5 years ago. But before he passed, he gave something to Reverend Pike. Some kind of confession or testimony. I don't know what was in it. Pike, Samuel said flatly. The same Pike who threatened to report us to the county? Yes, but Elijah trusted him. Said Pike was a man of God, even if he was harsh sometimes. Samuel stood and walked to the window. Snow was falling again, light and steady. Outside, the world was white and still and treacherous. Inside, 7 people depended on him to navigate legal threats that were just as deadly as any blizzard. We need that ledger, he said, and we need Pike to tell the truth. He'll never help us. Then we make him want to help us. The next morning, Samuel hitched his 2 horses to the wagon. It would take 3 hours to reach Coldwater in good weather. In snow that was still fresh and deep, it might take 5. Catherine insisted on coming, and Caleb refused to stay behind. Ruth would watch the younger children. The girl was responsible beyond her years, old enough to understand that sometimes adults had to leave, had to fight battles that children couldn't witness. They set out at dawn. The wagon creaked and groaned over frozen ruts. The horses labored, their breath steaming in the cold air. Samuel kept the Winchester across his lap, loaded and ready. He'd learned that Montana Territory was not a place for the unprepared. Coldwater was hardly a town. 200 people on a good day, most of them scattered across homesteads within a 15-mile radius. There was a church, a courthouse that doubled as a saloon, a general store, and a hotel with 6 rooms that were usually empty. The main street was mud in summer, ice in winter, and always thick with horse droppings. Samuel drove straight to the courthouse. Judge Cornelius Harrison kept an office on the 2nd floor, above the saloon. Samuel had met him once, briefly, when registering his land claim. But that wasn't the full story. That wasn't the connection that might save them now. Harrison's door was open. The judge sat behind a desk piled with papers, a gray-haired man of 62 with sharp eyes and hands that trembled slightly from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. He looked up as Samuel entered, and for a moment his face went blank with shock. Sam Hartwell, Harrison said slowly. I'll be damned. Judge. Thought you were dead, or hiding in Mexico. Montana's close enough to dead. Harrison laughed, a short bark that held no humor. What brings you here? And with a family, no less. Samuel gestured to Catherine and Caleb. This is Catherine Brennan and her son. We need your help. Legal help? The only kind that matters. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel with the careful attention of a man who'd seen too many desperate people make too many bad decisions. Last time I saw you was in Chicago, spring of '85. You were on trial for criminal negligence. Catherine's head turned sharply toward Samuel. He kept his eyes on Harrison. You got the charges reduced, Samuel said. Kept me out of prison. Because you agreed to pay restitution, every last penny you had. I heard you sold Hartwell and Sons for a quarter of what it was worth just to settle fast. I did. And then you disappeared. Rumor was you'd killed yourself, jumped into Lake Michigan. Some people said good riddance. Samuel felt Catherine's gaze on him, but didn't look away from Harrison. I didn't jump. I came here. To do what? Die slowly instead of quickly? Something like that. Harrison poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a glass, drank half, then set it down. So what do you want from me now? Samuel handed him the letter from Edward Cleary. Harrison read it carefully, his expression darkening with each paragraph. When he finished, he set it aside and looked at Catherine. Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry for your loss, and sorrier still for your circumstances. But I need to be honest with you. This claim is legally sound. Your husband died intestate. Under territorial law, property reverts to blood relatives in the absence of a valid will. The Brennan cousins have standing. Even though I'm his widow, even though I have 6 children, especially because of that. The law doesn't care about fairness, Mrs. Brennan. It cares about precedent and property rights. And right now, you have neither. What about the debt? Samuel asked. $3,500 from 1872. Does that strike you as legitimate? Harrison picked up the letter again. It's suspicious. The amount should be higher if interest was compounded. But without seeing the original promissory note, I can't say for certain. What if we could prove the debt was paid 15 years ago? Then you'd have grounds to dismiss the claim, but you'd need documentation. A receipt, a ledger entry, a witness testimony from someone credible. Samuel glanced at Catherine. Reverend Josiah Pike. He witnessed financial dealings for Elijah Brennan before he died. He might have records. Harrison's expression soured. Pike's a hard man, righteous in the worst way. He won't help you out of kindness. Then we'll appeal to his sense of truth. He's a man of God, isn't he? He should care about honesty. You'd think so, but Pike cares more about appearances than truth. He's already been spreading word around town that you two are living in sin. That kind of talk can destroy a woman's reputation out here, make it impossible for her to fight any legal battle. Catherine's face flushed. We're not, I know, Harrison said gently, but Pike doesn't care what's true. He cares what looks true. And what looks true is that a widow moved in with an unmarried man. That's enough for the orphans court to get involved. Caleb spoke up for the first time. What if they got married? Would that fix things? Harrison looked at the boy with something like respect. Smart kid. Yes, if Mrs. Brennan remarried, her new husband could file a joint property claim. It wouldn't erase the debt issue, but it would give you legal standing to fight the foreclosure. And it would shut down any custody concerns. Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He'd been thinking about this since reading the letter, turning it over in his mind, examining it from every angle, looking for alternatives. But there weren't any. Not if Catherine wanted to keep her children. Not if she wanted any chance at reclaiming her land. Give us a day, Samuel said. We need to talk to Pike first, see what records exist. Then we'll decide next steps. Harrison nodded. One more thing, Sam. Edward Cleary arrived in town yesterday. He's staying at the hotel with Tobias and Lucas Brennan, and they brought 6 hired men with them. This isn't just a legal fight. They're here to intimidate you. Samuel felt cold settle into his bones. How many men total? 9, counting Cleary. And they're not farmers or shopkeepers. They're the kind of men who get paid to make problems disappear. Noted. Harrison stood and walked them to the door. As Samuel was leaving, the judge put a hand on his shoulder. Sam, I don't know what you're planning, but be careful. The Brennan brothers aren't just debt collectors. They're dangerous. Word is they killed 2 claim jumpers in Colorado and got away with it because there were no witnesses. Then I'll make sure there are witnesses this time. They found Reverend Pike at the church, a small wooden building with a crooked steeple and windows that rattled in the wind. Pike was inside, sweeping the floor, his movements sharp and angry as if he were fighting the dust rather than cleaning it. He looked up as they entered, and his face hardened immediately. Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Brennan, come to confess your sins? Come to ask about Elijah Brennan, Samuel said evenly. That's confidential. A dying man's confession or a legal record? Both. Catherine stepped forward. Reverend, please, my children's lives depend on this. Your children's lives depend on you making proper choices, Mrs. Brennan. Living in sin with a stranger isn't a proper choice. Samuel felt his temper rising but forced it down. Reverend, I need to ask you directly. Did Elijah Brennan leave a ledger with you before he died? Pike's face twitched. Just a small movement, but enough. What if he did? Then I need to see it. Specifically, any entries regarding a debt payment to Thomas and Lawrence Brennan in August of 1881. The Reverend set down his broom. Why would you need that? Because Elijah's grandsons are claiming that debt was never paid. And if it was paid, they're committing fraud. Pike was silent for a long moment. Then he sat down heavily in a pew, suddenly looking much older than his 58 years. The ledger was destroyed, he said quietly. Fire in the church annex, 1883. All records lost. Convenient, Samuel said. It's the truth. Then how do you remember what was in it? Pike looked up sharply. I never said you didn't have to, but you do remember, don't you? August 12th, 1881. Elijah Brennan paid Thomas and Lawrence Brennan $3,500 in gold specie. You witnessed the transaction. You signed as witness. The color drained from Pike's face. How do you know that? Because I checked the church registry. You recorded it there. Financial transactions above $1,000 had to be registered with a church official under territorial law. You did your duty, Reverend. You documented it, which means you can testify to it. Pike stood abruptly, his hands shaking. You don't understand. If I testify against the Brennans, they'll kill me. Who will? Tobias and Lucas. They're not just cousins seeking inheritance. They're criminals. They've killed before. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. Catherine moved closer. Reverend, I have 6 children. If you don't testify, those men will take my land, and then they'll take my children. Put them in orphanages or indenture them to families who'll work them half to death. Is that what God wants? Pike closed his eyes. I don't know what God wants anymore. Then ask yourself what a man of honor would do, what a man who claims to serve truth would do. The silence stretched out, broken only by wind rattling the windows. Finally, Pike opened his eyes. The ledger wasn't destroyed, he said quietly. I lied about that. I hid it. I was afraid of what the Brennan family would do if they knew I had evidence of their father's gambling debts. Samuel felt hope surge. Where is it? Hidden, under the floorboards in my quarters. I can retrieve it. Do it, now, and then you'll testify. They'll come after me. Then I'll protect you. Pike laughed bitterly. How? You're one man. One man who's fought worse battles and survived. I'll keep you safe, Reverend. You have my word. Pike studied Samuel's face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever he found there must have been enough, because he nodded slowly. All right, God help us all. They retrieved the ledger from Pike's quarters. It was exactly as Caleb had described it, a leather-bound book filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting every financial transaction of Elijah Brennan's life. And there, on page 147, was the entry they needed. August 12th, 1881, paid in full to Thomas Brennan and Lawrence Brennan. Debt satisfaction, $3,500 in gold coin. Witnessed by Reverend J. Pike. Samuel photographed the page with his mind, memorizing every detail. This was their weapon. This was their proof. But it was also a target on Pike's back. Because once the Brennans knew this evidence existed, they'd do anything to destroy it. We need to file this with Judge Harrison immediately, Samuel said. Make it official record before anyone can interfere. They returned to the courthouse and presented the ledger to Harrison. The judge examined it carefully, comparing handwriting, checking dates, verifying authenticity. Finally, he nodded. This is legitimate, and it proves the debt was satisfied 15 years ago. The Brennan claim is fraudulent. Can you dismiss it? I can schedule a hearing, give both parties a chance to present evidence. But Sam, you need to understand something. The Brennans won't accept this quietly. They'll fight, and they'll fight dirty. Let them. And there's still the custody issue. Pike's testimony helps with the debt, but it doesn't solve the problem of Mrs. Brennan's living arrangements. The orphans' court can still intervene if they determine the children are in an improper environment. Samuel looked at Catherine. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. Then we need to remove that concern, Samuel said quietly. Catherine's breath caught. Samuel, Mrs. Brennan, I need to speak with you, privately. They stepped outside into the cold. Snow had started falling again, soft and persistent. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite her heavy coat. You're going to ask me to marry you, she said. For legal reasons. Yes, that's not a real marriage. It can be whatever we make it, but right now it's the only way to protect your children. Catherine turned away, staring out at the white landscape. I married James for love, We had nothing but each other and hope. And we built a life together. It wasn't much, but it was ours. When he died, I thought I'd never marry again. Never trust anyone enough. Never feel safe enough. I understand. Do you? She turned back to him, and he saw tears on her face. Do you really understand what you're asking? You're asking me to tie my life to a stranger, to trust a man I've known for 2 weeks, to let you become father to my children. That's not just legal paperwork, Samuel. That's everything. I know. Then why? Why would you do this? Samuel took a long breath, choosing his words carefully. Because when I saw you in that blizzard carrying Thomas, with those 5 children following you like you were the only thing keeping them away, I saw what I should have been for David and Emma. A protector. Someone who acts instead of hesitating. Someone who saves people instead of killing them through negligence. You're not responsible for that train accident. Yes, I am. I owned the company. I cut corners. I prioritized profit over safety. And 29 people died because of my choices. He paused. I can't save them. I can't bring David and Emma back. But I can save you. I can save your children. And that might not be redemption, Catherine, but it's a start. She was crying openly now. I'm not your redemption. No, you're my second chance. And I'll be damned if I waste it. Catherine wiped her face with the back of her hand. If I say yes, this has to be real, not just legal. I won't have my children raised in a house without love. Then we'll make it real. You promise? I promise. She studied his face for a long moment, and Samuel felt the weight of that scrutiny. She was measuring him, judging whether his words matched his intent, whether she could trust him with everything that mattered. Finally, she nodded. Then yes, I'll marry you. Samuel felt something shift in his chest. Not quite joy, not quite relief, but something close to both. We'll do it properly. Harrison can perform the ceremony. Make it official. When? As soon as possible, before the Brennans realize what we're planning. They went back inside and told Harrison. The judge raised his eyebrows but didn't comment. He'd seen stranger marriages in the territory. Hell, he'd performed stranger marriages. At least these two seemed to actually like each other. I can do it tomorrow, Harrison said. But Sam, there's something you need to know. Edward Cleary knows you're here. He asked about you at the hotel. Asked specifically about your past, your business in Chicago, your reasons for coming to Montana. What did you tell him? Nothing, but he's digging. And once he finds out who you really are, what you really did, he's going to use it against you. Against both of you. Let him try. They left the courthouse as afternoon shadows were growing long. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, each of them lost in thought. Caleb sat in the back of the wagon, clutching the ledger like it was the most precious thing in the world. Which in a way it was. It was proof, it was power, it was the weapon they'd needed. But Samuel knew that weapons could be turned against you if you weren't careful. And he knew that men like Tobias and Lucas Brennan didn't fight fair. They fought to win, no matter the pinch. As they crested the final hill before home, Samuel saw smoke rising from his chimney and felt a surge of gratitude for the simple fact of that smoke. That home, that place of safety. Inside were 5 children who trusted him, who depended on him, who'd given him a reason to wake up each morning instead of wishing he hadn't. He'd failed David. He'd failed Emma. He'd failed 29 innocent people who'd boarded a train they thought was safe. But he wouldn't fail Catherine. He wouldn't fail her children. Whatever it took, whatever price he had to pay, he would keep them safe. That night after dinner, after the children had been told the news and had reacted with a mixture of excitement and confusion, after everything had settled into an uneasy quiet, Samuel and Catherine sat by the fire. The younger children were asleep. Caleb was on watch by the window, rifle across his lap, taking his new responsibilities seriously. Tomorrow changes everything, Catherine said softly. Yes. Are you afraid? Samuel considered the question. No, I've done things worth being afraid of. This isn't one of them. What if we fail? What if they take the children anyway? Then we'll run. Take them west. California maybe, Oregon. Somewhere the law can't reach us. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, if that's what it takes. Catherine reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rough from work, but warm. Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won. No, but we're fighting. That's more than I had 2 weeks ago. They sat in silence, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. Inside, 7 people breathed in sleep, safe for now, protected for now, loved in a way that was still new and fragile, but growing stronger every day. Tomorrow they would marry. Tomorrow they would take the fight to the Brennans. Tomorrow they would stake their claim, not just to land, but to the right to be a family, to choose their own futures, to stand against men who thought power and money could override justice and love. But tonight they were just 2 people sitting by a fire, finding comfort in each other's presence, building something that might be strong enough to withstand the storm that was coming. Daniel sat back slowly, his eyes wide. Grandpa, what happened next? Did they attack? Samuel smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. Patience, boy. The best stories can't be rushed. But you survived, obviously. Survived, yes, but survival isn't the same as victory, and victory always comes with a price. He reached for the poker and stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. Outside, the snow had thickened, turning the world beyond the windows into a white void, just like that night, just like every night that mattered. Where was I? You were going to marry Grandma Kate. Ah, yes, that was the plan anyway, but plans have a way of changing when desperate men get involved. Samuel settled back into his chair, and his voice took on that faraway quality that meant he was no longer in the present, but somewhere deep in memory, reliving moments that had shaped everything that came after. They never made it to the wedding ceremony the next morning. At midnight, Samuel woke to the sound of horses. Not one or two, but many, moving fast through snow that should have muffled their approach. He was on his feet instantly, Winchester in hand, moving to the window. 8 riders circled the property, visible by the torches they carried. The flames cast dancing shadows across the snow, turning the peaceful winter landscape into something from a nightmare. Samuel counted quickly. 8 men on horseback, all armed, forming a loose perimeter around the cabin. At the head of the group sat a man on a massive bay gelding. Even at this distance, Samuel could see the family resemblance. Tobias Brennan, 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. Next to him rode a younger man, slimmer but with the same hard eyes. Lucas Brennan, the brothers who'd come to claim what they believed was theirs. Hartwell, Tobias's voice carried across the frozen air, loud and commanding. I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like reasonable men. Samuel didn't move. Behind him he heard Catherine rise, heard her quiet footsteps as she gathered the younger children and herded them toward the root cellar beneath the cabin. Caleb appeared at his side, shotgun in hand, his young face set with determination that made him look older than his 13 years. What do we do? The boy whispered. We wait. Let them make the first real move. Right now they're just posturing. Hartwell, Tobias called again. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Sign over the land and we ride out. Refuse and things get ugly. Samuel opened the window just wide enough to speak through. The land's not mine to sign. It belongs to my wife. Even in the torchlight, he could see Tobias's sneer. Your wife? That's rich, Hartwell. She's got no more claim than a prairie dog. That land belonged to James Brennan, and now it belongs to his blood family. Judge Harrison disagrees, so does territorial law. Law's whatever I say it is out here. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known men like Tobias before, men who believed might made right, who thought violence was just another tool in the negotiation process. Men who wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted or someone stopped them permanently. Then you're going to have to take it, Samuel called back. There was a moment of silence. Then Tobias laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. You know what your problem is, Hartwell? You think you're still in Chicago, think you can buy your way out of trouble with your blood money. But out here, money doesn't mean shit unless you have the strength to keep it. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. So they knew. They'd done their research, dug into his past, found out about the train accident and the settlement, in the fortune he'd tried to leave behind. Edward Cleary had been busy. "I know about the copper mine, Tobias," Samuel called out, changing tactics. "I know you and your brother killed 3 claim jumpers in Colorado. I know you're not here for family. You're here for money." The reaction was immediate. Tobias went rigid in his saddle. Lucas's horse danced sideways, responding to its rider's sudden tension. The hired guns looked at each other, uncertain. "Who told you that?" Tobias demanded. "I've got friends in Helena, Territory Marshal's office. They've been looking for you. In fact, I sent a telegram yesterday. Marshal should be here by dawn." It was a bluff. Samuel hadn't sent any telegram, but he said it with enough conviction that even Lucas looked worried, leaning over to whisper something to his brother. Tobias waved him off angrily. "You're lying." "Am I? You willing to bet your freedom on it?" For a moment, Samuel thought it might work, thought they might ride away, regroup, come back with lawyers instead of guns. But then Lucas said something else, something Samuel couldn't hear, and Tobias's face hardened into something ugly and determined. "We'll take our chances." Tobias yanked something from his saddlebag and hurled it toward the chicken coop. The torch arced through the air, trailing sparks, and landed in the dry straw near the structure. Flames erupted immediately, fed by the wind and the tender, dry wood. Samuel swore and grabbed a bucket of water they kept by the door. "Caleb, cover me!" He burst out of the cabin, running low toward the fire. Behind him, he heard Caleb's shotgun boom once, a warning shot that scattered snow near the riders' horses. The animal spooked, buying Samuel precious seconds. He threw water on the flames, dousing some but not all. Another torch came flying through the air. This one landed near the goat pen. Samuel dropped the bucket and dove for cover as gunfire erupted. Bullets spanged off the frozen ground, kicked up snow, splintered wood. He rolled behind a water trough and came up with his Winchester, sighting carefully. He fired once. The shot took the hat clean off one of the hired guns, sending the man tumbling backward off his horse in surprise and fear. Another shot. This one clipped the shoulder of a second rider, who screamed and dropped his rifle. Not fatal, but enough to make the man think twice about continuing the fight. Samuel wasn't trying to kill anyone, not yet, but he was making it clear that he could if pushed. More fire, more shots. The night erupted into chaos. Samuel ran toward the burning straw near the goat pen, trying to stamp out the flames before they spread. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. He spun and fired back, saw Lucas Brennan clutch his hand and drop his pistol, saw blood dark against the snow. Then pain exploded in Samuel's left shoulder. He'd been so focused on Lucas that he hadn't seen Tobias line up the shot. The bullet punched through muscle and out the other side. A through and through that hurt like hellfire but wasn't immediately fatal. Samuel stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. Had to keep moving, had to protect the cabin, had to protect his family. Caleb was firing from the window now, methodical shots that kept the riders at bay. The boy had learned well. Each shot counted. Each shot made the hired guns think twice about pressing the attack. But there were still 6 of them out there, plus Tobias and Lucas, and Samuel was bleeding, and the fire was spreading. Just when Samuel thought they might be overwhelmed, new sounds cut through the night. More horses, more riders. But these were coming from the west, from the direction of Coldwater, and they were moving with purpose. Judge Harrison led the charge, rifle across his saddle, followed by Sheriff Clayton and a dozen armed men from town. Behind them, incredibly, rode Reverend Pike, clutching a Bible in one hand and the reins in the other, his face pale but determined. "Tobias Brennan!" Harrison's voice boomed with authority. "You're under arrest for arson and attempted murder." "Under whose authority?" Tobias snarled. "Mine. I'm a territorial judge and I have a warrant signed by the Marshal in Helena. Drop your weapons now or we will fire." The hired guns looked at each other, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted dramatically. They were outnumbered now, facing armed townsmen who had the law on their side. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Only Tobias and Lucas held out, still mounted, still defiant. Pike urged his horse forward, moving between the two groups. His voice shook but carried. "Tobias, Lucas, I've known your family for 20 years. Your father was a good man. What are you doing?" "Claiming what's ours, old man." It's not yours. Elijah Brennan paid that debt in 1881. I witnessed it. I signed the document. Lucas spat into the snow. You're lying. Our father told us that money was never paid. Your father lied to you. He took Elijah's $3,500 and gambled it away in St. Louis. Lost it all on cards and horse and women. He died broken, ashamed, and he couldn't bear to tell you the truth. The words hung in the frozen air. Tobias's face went from red to white. No, he wouldn't. He did. I have Elijah's ledger. I have the registry entry. I have proof. You've been chasing a debt that doesn't exist, trying to steal land to cover your father's sins. Something broke in Tobias then. Samuel saw it happen, saw the moment when rage overwhelmed reason. Tobias reached for his pistol, yanking it from the holster, swinging it toward Pike. Samuel moved on instinct, bringing his Winchester up despite the screaming pain in his shoulder, sighting down the barrel. But he didn't need to fire. Sheriff Clayton was faster, his shot precise and professional. The bullet caught Tobias in the leg, shattering his knee. The big man howled and toppled from his saddle, landing hard in the snow. Lucas started to reach for his own weapon, then thought better of it, hands rising slowly in surrender. It's over, Clayton said flatly. Tobias Brennan, Lucas Brennan, you're under arrest. Charges are arson, attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and assault with intent to kill. The hired guns can ride out now and never show their faces in Montana territory again, or they can join you in the Deer Lodge Penitentiary for the next 5 years. Your choice. The hired men didn't hesitate. They wheeled their horses and rode hard into the darkness, leaving Tobias writhing in pain and Lucas standing with his hands up, blood still dripping from where Samuel's bullet had creased his palm. Samuel stumbled as the adrenaline drained away, suddenly aware of how much blood he was losing. Catherine was there instantly, materializing from the cabin, her hands pressing a cloth against his shoulder. The younger children spilled out behind her, shocked and frightened, but alive, safe. You're hurt, Catherine said, her voice tight with concern. I've been worse. Don't lie to me, Samuel Hartwell. You're bleeding like a stuck pig. Harrison dismounted and approached, looking at Samuel's wound with a practiced eye. Bullet went through, that's good. Clean it, stitch it. You'll live. Hurt like hell for a few weeks, though. I can handle pain. I know you can. Saw you handle worse in Chicago. Harrison turned to Catherine. Mrs. Brennan, you've got a brave man here. Foolish, maybe, but brave. I'm starting to realize that, Catherine said, her hand still pressed against Samuel's wound. They got Samuel inside and onto the table. Catherine, who'd birthed 6 children with only a midwife's help, knew her way around injuries. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched it with thread she'd used for mending clothes, and wrapped it tight with strips of clean linen. Samuel gritted his teeth through the whole process, refusing to cry out in front of the children. While she worked, Sheriff Clayton and his men secured Tobias and Lucas. The younger Brennan brother was sullen but cooperative. Tobias had to be dragged, still cursing and threatening, his shattered knee leaving a trail of blood in the snow. They loaded both men onto a wagon for transport back to Coldwater in the territorial jail. Edward Cleary appeared just before dawn, riding up slowly with his hands visible and empty. He'd stayed in town during the violence, claiming later that he'd had no knowledge of the Brennans' plans. Whether that was true or not, he was clearly done with the whole affair. Judge Harrison, Cleary said formally, I wish to withdraw my representation of the Brennan family. Upon further investigation, I've determined that their claims lack merit and their methods are unconscionable. I've filed the appropriate paperwork with the court. Convenient timing, Harrison said dryly. I'm a lawyer, not a criminal. I don't condone violence. But you're happy to profit from it when it serves your clients. Cleary flushed but didn't argue. He handed over a stack of documents, settlement agreements withdrawing any claims against Catherine's property, acknowledgments that the debt had been satisfied in 1881, releases of any and all future litigation. Everything they needed, signed and notarized. The land is yours, Mrs. Brennan, Cleary said stiffly. Or Hartwell, I suppose, given your recent arrangement. I apologize for the distress this matter has caused. He rode away before anyone could respond, probably eager to put as much distance between himself and the failed claim as possible. Harrison collected the documents and added them to his satchel. We'll still need a formal hearing, the judge said. Make everything official. But with these documents in Pike's testimony, the case is closed. The land is yours. Catherine nodded, too exhausted to speak. She'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, terrified that she'd lose everything, that her children would be taken, that the man who'd saved them would die protecting them. Now it was over. Now they'd won. But the victory felt fragile, like something that could shatter if she examined it too closely. The formal hearing took place 3 days later in Coldwater's courthouse. By then, Samuel's wound had stopped bleeding and started healing, though it still hurt to lift his left arm. The whole town turned out to watch, packing into the small courtroom until people were standing 3 deep along the walls. Judge Harrison presided, his manner grave and formal. Tobias and Lucas Brennan sat in chains, Tobias's legs splinted and wrapped, his face gray with pain and hatred. Edward Cleary sat in the back, no longer involved but apparently curious to see how it ended. And in the front row, Catherine sat with her 6 children, Samuel beside her, his wounded arm in a sling. Harrison called the hearing to order and began presenting evidence. He read from Elijah Brennan's ledger, the entry clear and unambiguous. August 12, 1881. Debt satisfied, $3,500 paid in full. Witnessed by Reverend J. Pike. Pike himself took the stand, his voice steady despite visible nervousness. I witnessed Elijah Brennan pay Thomas Brennan $3,500 in gold coin. The debt was satisfied. Thomas signed a receipt, which I also witnessed. The transaction was legal and binding. Tobias tried to object. He's lying. Our father wouldn't. Harrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. You'll have your turn to speak, Mr. Brennan. Right now, you'll be silent. The judge called Samuel next. Samuel explained how he'd discovered the discrepancy in the claimed amount, how he'd traced the records, how he'd worked with Pike to uncover the truth. He presented the assayer's report from Helena, showing that the Dry Fork land contained copper deposits worth potentially $50,000 or more. The Brennan brothers weren't interested in family honor, Samuel said clearly. They were interested in mineral rights. They fabricated a debt claim to force Mrs. Brennan off land they intended to exploit for profit. Harrison nodded slowly. Mr. Tobias Brennan, do you have anything to say in your defense? Tobias glared at the judge, at Samuel, at Pike, at everyone who'd conspired to thwart him. My father told us that money was never paid. We believed him. If he lied, that's on him, not us. Perhaps, but arson and attempted murder are on you, as is conspiracy to commit fraud. Even if you genuinely believed the debt was owed, your methods were criminal. We were protecting what was rightfully ours. Nothing about that land was rightfully yours. The debt was paid 15 years ago. James Brennan inherited clear title. His widow had every right to that property, and her new husband now shares that right. Tobias's eyes cut to Catherine and Samuel, pure venom in his gaze. You think you won, Hartwell? You think marrying her makes you clean? Everyone knows what you are. Everyone knows you killed 29 people in Chicago. You're a murderer, and everyone in this courtroom knows it. The room erupted in whispers. Catherine felt people staring, felt the weight of judgment settling over them like a shroud. But Samuel didn't flinch, didn't look away. You're right, Ito, he said quietly. I am responsible for those deaths. I made decisions that cost people their lives, including my own brother and niece. I've paid compensation to every family affected. I've tried to make amends, but I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be better now. He looked at Catherine, and his voice strengthened. I married Catherine Brennan not out of obligation or convenience. I married her because she and her children gave me a reason to be better. They gave me something worth defending with my life. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve the chance they gave me. The courtroom was silent. Even the whispers had stopped. Harrison cleared his throat and raised his gavel. Based on the evidence presented, I rule as follows. The debt claimed by Tobias and Lucas Brennan was satisfied in full on August 12, 1881. Their claim against the Dry Fork property is dismissed with prejudice. Catherine Hartwell, formerly Brennan, retains full legal ownership of said property, now held jointly with her husband, Samuel Hartwell. The gavel fell. Furthermore, I find Tobias and Lucas Brennan guilty of attempted arson, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted murder. Sentence is 5 years hard labor at Deer Lodge Penitentiary to be served consecutively. This court is adjourned. The room erupted in applause. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face, felt Caleb's arm around her shoulders, felt Ruth and Henry and Josephine and Louisa gathering tight around her. Thomas, now walking steadily at 2 years old, grabbed Samuel's good hand and held on tight. Samuel looked down at the boy and smiled. A real smile. The first one Catherine had seen that reached his eyes and stayed there. He picked Thomas up with his good arm, settled the child on his hip, and turned to face the crowd. They were his now. All of them. Not through obligation or guilt, but through choice, through commitment, through love that had grown slowly in the cold and dark and emerged into light. Outside, people came to offer congratulations. Some had been skeptical of Samuel, wary of his past, but they'd seen him fight for a family that wasn't his by blood. They'd seen him take a bullet defending children he'd known for less than a month. Actions spoke louder than history. Reverend Pike approached last, his face solemn. "Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell, I owe you both an apology. I judged you harshly without knowing your circumstances. I let fear and propriety blind me to simple human decency." "You testified when it mattered," Samuel said. "That takes courage." "Not as much courage as you showed. I heard what you did, riding out into that gunfight with a wounded shoulder to save the livestock. That's the action of a man who understands responsibility." Samuel shook the Reverend's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Pike hesitated, then said, "I never did properly bless your marriage. If you'd allow me, I'd like to perform a ceremony, a real one, with the community as witness. Show everyone that what you have is genuine and worthy of respect." Catherine and Samuel looked at each other. They'd married in Harrison's office 3 days ago, a quick civil ceremony with Caleb as witness, legal and binding, but not particularly romantic. The idea of a real wedding, a public declaration, appealed to both of them. "We'd be honored," Catherine said. The ceremony took place the following Sunday at the Coldwater Baptist Church. The building was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls and in the doorway. Catherine wore a dress she'd made from the blue calico Samuel had bought her. Simple but beautiful. Samuel wore his best shirt, the one Catherine had mended where the bullet had torn through. The children stood with them at the altar. Caleb, now 14 and looking more like a man every day, held the ring Samuel had purchased in Coldwater, a simple gold band that had cost him $15 but meant everything. Ruth held Thomas, who'd been dressed in his best clothes and looked solemn and important. Pike conducted the ceremony with surprising warmth, his harsh manner softened by genuine emotion. "Marriage is not merely a legal contract," he said. "It's a covenant between two people who choose each other, who commit to facing life's hardships together, who build something larger than themselves." He looked at Samuel and Catherine. "You two have already faced hardship together. You fought for each other, bled for each other, stood against those who would tear you apart. You've proven your commitment in ways most couples never have to. Now you stand before God and this community to make that commitment eternal." Samuel took Catherine's hands in his. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Catherine, when I met you, I was a man who'd given up on life. I'd lost my family, lost my purpose, lost any hope of redemption. But you showed me that it's never too late to choose differently. Never too late to be the person you should have been all along. I vow to stand beside you, to protect you and your children, to be the husband and father that you all deserve, for as long as I draw breath." Catherine's voice trembled, but didn't break. "Samuel, you saved my life and the lives of my children. But more than that, you gave us hope. You showed us that kindness still exists, that good men still walk this earth, that we're worthy of being protected and cherished. I vow to be your partner, your companion, your home. I choose you, Samuel Hartwell, today and every day forward." Pike smiled. "By the power vested in me by Montana Territory and by God above, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined, let no man put asunder." They kissed and the church erupted in applause and cheers. Thomas wriggled free from Ruth's grasp and ran to Samuel, who picked him up and held him close. The other children drew near, and for a moment they were just a family, standing together in a church filled with people who'd come to witness something true and good and worth celebrating. The reception was held at the church hall, a simple affair with food brought by townspeople and music played on fiddles and harmonicas. Samuel danced with Catherine, carefully favoring his wounded shoulder, and she laughed for the first time in months, really laughed, her face transformed by joy. Later, as the sun set and people began drifting home, Samuel and Catherine stood outside in the cold, watching their children play in the snow. Caleb was teaching Henry how to track rabbits. Ruth was helping Josephine and Louisa build a snowman. Thomas was eating snow and grinning like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. "We did it," Catherine said softly. "We actually did it." "You had doubts?" "Every day, every hour. I kept thinking something would go wrong, that they'd take the children, or you'd change your mind, or I'd wake up and find it was all a dream." Samuel pulled her close with his good arm. "It's real. All of it. The land, the marriage, the family. It's ours now. What do we do with it? We build. We plant in spring. We raise cattle and horse. We send the children to school. We make something that lasts." Catherine looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw hope and trust, and something deeper. Something that would take time to fully develop, but was already there, already growing. "I love you, Samuel Hartwell," she said. "I didn't expect to, but I do." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "I love you too. I think I have since that first night when you kept walking through the blizzard because you refused to give up. You're the strongest person I've ever known." They stood together as darkness fell, as stars emerged in the clear winter sky, as their children played and laughed and lived the lives they'd almost lost. The war was over, the battle won, the family secured. But the real work was just beginning. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Samuel and Catherine expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land from homesteaders who couldn't make it through harsh winters. They hired help during harvest season, always paying fair wages, always treating workers with respect. The copper mine on their property attracted interest from companies in Denver and San Francisco, and Samuel negotiated contracts that gave them 25% of all profits while requiring the mining companies to restore the land when extraction was complete. The children thrived. Caleb went to study law in Helena at 18, determined to help people navigate the legal system that had almost destroyed his family. Ruth became a teacher, opening a school for ranch children who couldn't afford to board in town. Henry learned blacksmithing and opened his own shop in Coldwater. Josephine's artwork sold in galleries as far away as Chicago. Louisa married a doctor and helped him establish the territory's first proper hospital. And Thomas, who'd been dying of hypothermia the night Samuel found them, grew into a strong, kind man who took over the ranch and ran it with the same careful attention to duty and compassion his stepfather had shown. Samuel and Catherine had one more child together, a daughter they named Emma, after the niece Samuel had lost. She was born in the spring of 1888, delivered at home with Ruth assisting, and all the other children waiting anxiously for their first glimpse of their baby sister. When Samuel held her for the first time, he wept openly, no longer ashamed of his emotions, no longer afraid to show vulnerability. The ranch prospered. The mining contracts brought steady income. They became pillars of the community, respected for their integrity and generosity. People forgot about Chicago, or if they remembered, they chose to focus on the man Samuel had become rather than the man he'd been. But Samuel never forgot. He kept newspaper clippings about the train accident in his desk drawer, reading them periodically to remind himself of the cost of carelessness, the weight of responsibility. He donated money anonymously to the families of the victims, continuing payments long after the legal settlements had been satisfied. And every March 15th, the anniversary of the accident, he rode alone to a hill overlooking his ranch and spent the day in silent reflection, honoring David and Emma and all those he'd failed to save. Catherine understood. She never tried to talk him out of those annual pilgrimages, never suggested he was dwelling on the past. She knew that guilt, properly channeled, could be a powerful force for good. Samuel's guilt had driven him to save her family. It had driven him to build something meaningful and lasting. It had made him into the man she loved. In the winter of 1900, 14 years after that first blizzard, Samuel was checking fence lines when he saw a familiar sight. A woman walking through snow, struggling against the wind, three children trailing behind her. They were heading east, toward the cliffs, toward danger. Samuel didn't hesitate. He rode out to meet them, and when he reached them, he saw the same desperate determination he had seen in Catherine all those years ago. The woman's name was Margaret. Her husband had died of influenza. She'd been evicted by a bank. She had nowhere to go and three children depending on her. "Follow me," Samuel said. Margaret looked up at him with wary, exhausted eyes. "Why would you help us?" "Because someone helped me once, and because it's the right thing to do." He brought them back to the ranch, where Catherine welcomed them without question, without hesitation. They made room, they shared food, they offered safety and warmth and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. Margaret and her children stayed through the winter. In spring, Samuel helped her file a homestead claim on land adjacent to his property. He taught her sons how to build fences and plant crops and survive in a territory that didn't forgive mistakes. And when Margaret married a widower from Coldwater 2 years later, combining their homesteads into a viable ranch, Samuel and Catherine stood as witnesses, pleased to see another family finding solid ground. It became a pattern. Over the years, other desperate families found their way to the Hartwell Ranch. Some stayed a few weeks, some stayed months. All of them left stronger than they had arrived, carrying with them the knowledge that kindness existed, that help was possible, that they weren't alone in the world. Caleb noticed the pattern and asked his stepfather about it one spring afternoon in 1902. They were repairing the barn roof, working side by side the way they had for years. "Pa, why do you do it? Taking strangers? You've got enough to worry about without adding other people's problems." Samuel paused, hammer in hand, looking out over land that had once been barren but now flourished with life. "Because I was given a second chance. Your mother gave me that. You and your siblings gave me that. And the only way to honor that gift is to pass it forward." "But you can't save everyone?" "No, but I can save some, and some is better than none." Caleb nodded slowly, understanding settling over his young face. "When I open my law practice, I'm going to offer free services 1 day a week for people who can't afford representation." Samuel smiled. "That's good, son. That's exactly right." The conversation stayed with Samuel long after Caleb had returned to Helena. It crystallized something he'd been thinking about for years. He called Catherine into his study that evening and showed her his ledgers, his accounts, his projections. "I want to establish a fund," he said, "for families in distress, widows, orphans, homesteaders who've lost everything. Enough money to give them a fresh start. New land, new equipment, legal representation if they need it." Catherine looked at the figures and smiled. "How much?" "10,000 to start, more as we can afford it. I'll call it the Emma Fund, in memory of my niece, and in honor of every child who deserves a chance to live." They established the fund in 1903. By 1910, it had helped 47 families. By 1920, over 100. The money came from their mining contracts, from careful management of ranch resources, from Samuel's investments in businesses throughout Montana Territory and later Montana State when statehood was achieved in 1889. And now, in the winter of 1920, Samuel Hartwell sat in his comfortable chair by the fire, 68 years old and tired but content, telling his grandson about the night that had changed everything. "So that's how Grandma and I met," he said, finishing the story as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "A blizzard, a desperate family, and a man who finally figured out that redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you choose every single day." Daniel sat back, his face reflecting a mix of emotions. Awe, sadness, hope. "That's the best story I've ever heard, Grandpa. It's not just a story, boy, it's what happened. And it taught me the most important lesson of my life." "What's that?" "That we're not defined by our worst day. We're defined by what we do after. By the choices we make when we could just as easily give up. By the people we save when saving them doesn't benefit us at all." The door opened and Catherine entered, moving slowly at 78, but still strong, still fierce, still the woman who'd walked through a blizzard because she refused to let her children die. She carried a tray with coffee and fresh biscuits, setting it on the table between Samuel and Daniel. "You telling Daniel about the blizzard again?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He asked. He always asks. She sat in the chair next to Samuel's, close enough that he could take her hand. "Best night of my life, even though I was freezing." "Mine too," Samuel said softly. Daniel looked between them, seeing something he was still too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as important. "Really? Even with everything that happened after? The fire and the trial and almost dying?" Samuel and Catherine answered together, their voices blending in the practiced harmony of people who'd spent 34 years saying the same truths to each other, especially because of everything after. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sun was rising, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and pink and pure white. The ranch spread out below the house, buildings and fences and fields that represented decades of work and love and commitment. And in the distance, barely visible in the morning light, a wagon moved along the road that passed their property. Samuel stood and moved to the window, his old eyes still keen enough to make out details. A man driving, a woman beside him, 3 children in the back, huddled under blankets. The wagon was heading east, toward the cliffs, toward danger. Samuel reached for his coat. "Samuel?" Catherine's voice held both concern and understanding. "They're going the wrong way," he said simply. Catherine stood and fetched his warmest scarf, the one she'd knitted for him their first winter together. She wrapped it around his neck, her movements gentle and familiar. "Don't be gone too long. Breakfast will be ready in an hour." "I won't." Daniel jumped up. "Can I come, Grandpa?" Samuel looked at the boy, seeing in his eager face the same determination that had driven Caleb all those years ago, the same desire to help, to act, to be part of something larger than himself. "Yes," Samuel said. "It's time you learned this lesson firsthand." They rode out together into the bright Montana morning, grandfather and grandson, following in the tracks of a wagon that was heading toward disaster. When they caught up, Samuel would stop them. He'd show them the right direction, and if they had nowhere to go, he'd bring them home. Because that's what you did when you had been given a second chance. You passed it forward. You saved people not because it was easy or convenient or profitable, but because it was right, because everyone deserved the opportunity to stand in the warmth and light after struggling through cold and darkness. Because 34 years ago, a man named Samuel Hartwell had seen a woman carrying her dying child through a blizzard, and instead of riding past, instead of looking away, instead of telling himself it wasn't his problem, he'd made a choice that changed 7 lives forever. He'd offered them shelter. He'd given them hope, and she had, and it had saved them both. As Samuel and Daniel rode toward the distant wagon, the rising sun caught the snow and turned the whole world golden. Behind them, smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, carrying the promise of warmth and safety and home. Ahead lay strangers in need, people who didn't yet know their luck was about to change. Samuel smiled and urged his horse forward. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And as long as he drew breath, as long as he had the strength to ride and the means to help, he would do that work gladly. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, not even for peace, but because Catherine Brennan had trusted a stranger in a snowstorm. And because 6 children had given him a reason to be better. And because his brother David and his niece Emma, resting in that cemetery in Illinois, deserved to be honored not with grief and guilt, but with action and love, and the commitment to make sure no other family suffered the way they had. The wagon ahead stopped as Samuel approached. The driver looked up, wary and exhausted. Samuel raised his hand in greeting, his voice carrying across the frozen distance. "You're headed the wrong way. Cliffsides 3 miles east. Nothing that direction but dead ends and hard dying." The man in the wagon slumped slightly, relief and despair mixing on his face. "We're not lost, mister. We're just trying to find somewhere. Anywhere." Samuel smiled. "Then you're in luck, because I know exactly where you need to be." "Where's that?" "Home." And as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist, Samuel Hartwell led another lost family towards safety, continuing the work that would define not just his legacy, but the legacy of everyone he'd touched. A legacy built not on wealth or power or fame, but on the simple, radical act of choosing to help when help was needed most. The story didn't end that day. It never really ended. It just continued, passing from generation to generation, father to son, mother to daughter, a covenant unbroken and unbreakable. The covenant that said we take care of our own, and our own is anyone who needs us. That was Samuel Hartwell's true redemption. Not in the money he gave or the land he owned, or even the family he built, but in the simple daily choice to offer help when help was needed most, every single time.